Hello friends, welcome to the discourse on disability. Today the lecture is going to be on the topic the rights of minorities, differently abled people. India has a special bond with the doctrine of human rights. Independent India's tryst with her destiny that began on 15 August 1947 and the adoption for a Declaration of Human Rights UDHR by the General Assembly of United Nations on 10th December 1948 happened one after the other as if each one is a puzzle in a coterminous sequence. The UDHR 1948 also came at a time when the Constitution Assembly was in the final stages of drafting the Constitution for free India. It may not be an over-exaggeration to suggest that the Indian Constitution benefited from the UDHR in a great way. Part 3 of the Constitution detailing fundamental rights granted to the citizens of independent India leans quite heavily towards the inalienable rights of individual rights laid down in the UDHR. This is indeed more than a mere coincidence, though still at her infancy as an independent nation just coming out of the shackles of a 500 years of colonial rule, deeply wounded by the violence of subcontinental partition and inflicted by the deaths of chronic hunger and widespread drought, India went ahead and signed the UDHR 1948 without a second thought, joining the League of Founding Members of one of the most valuable international covenants of the 20th century. Subsequently, India ratified the relevant protocols and United Nations bills on human rights. India's commitment to the doctrine of individual rights enshrined in the UDHR 1948 is clearly reflected in a plethora of laws enacted by the Parliament over a period of time. In particular, laws dealing with the issues of women, children, elderly, war victims, refugees, indigenous population in the country, prison inmates, people of transgender, of late persons with disabilities, actively incorporate the principles of human rights. It is in this context that a discussion on disability policy through the prism of human rights becomes important. In this lecture, I am going to focus on three important aspects. First, I will offer a glimpse into the notion of disability. Second, I will make an attempt to introduce the major debates in disability discourse. Third, I will trace the trajectory of disability law in India, juxtaposing it with our commitment to international conventions. All this, of course, goes without saying through the lens of human rights. Disability during the antique times. How was it like? No explanation of disability is ever complete without its historical backdrop, and interestingly enough, our epic history is full of examples where individuals with disabilities were assigned highly significant roles. Valmiki, that scrupulous author of epic Ramayana, who stood by Sita when the whole world had forsaken her, was a totally blind man. While it is not clear whether Valmiki was blind by birth or his blindness was due to his advancing age, what remains unequivocally clear, however, is that by the time Sita came in contact with him subsequently, therefore, when he wrote down the epic history for us, he was completely sightless. By all accounts, then, we had India's John Milton thousands of years before Europe's Valmiki was born. At the center of other epic, Mahabharata, was Dhritarashtra, a strong man born blind under a very peculiar circumstance. We won't get into the story at the moment, but it may be useful to point out that Dhritarashtra was the child of a sage and wise man Vyasa. Just before the epic war of Mahabharata is to take place, Vyasa appears to Dhritarashtra with an offer of divine sight, using which Dhritarashtra, if willing, can witness the war between Pandavas and Kauravas. King Dhritarashtra refuses his father's offer without second thought, fully realizing paternal pain he might have to be subjected, seeing his own sons being slaughtered in the battleground. But when the war finally ended, proving his suspicion right, he did not hesitate to embrace Pandavas and hand over the kingdom. So, the notion of disability has been part of our epic history and our epic consciousness. Instead of trivializing disability, the antique history considered it as part of dharmic cycle. But the notion of disability introduced to us in the 20th century has a different context altogether. World War II provides one of the major backdrops for the disability in the modern times. One of the major consequences of this war is that millions and millions of proud military men were left blinded, crippled and disabled in ways that no one could ever imagine. When they traveled back home at the end of the war, their resettlement and rehabilitation became a challenge for the states that sponsored their participation. This challenge was mounted more forcefully in countries like the United States of America, Soviet Union, Britain, France and Germany that took active part in the war. Under pressure from civil society organizations, religious institutions and family members of disabled war heroes, the successive governments in these countries had to prove time and again that they were not abandoning their former soldiers who fought for their national pride at the expense of their own future well-being. Such an intervention by the modern state provided a fillip for persons with disabilities, including those who acquired disability through factors other than the war. Roughly by 1960s, persons with disabilities began to form associations of their own, emerging as pressure groups with potential to work for themselves. They demanded more from the state, trained their family members to deal with their requirements, oriented the civil society groups around them, and most important of all, insisted that their religions should treat them through an empathetic eye rather than by charitable hands. The first and foremost task on hand for these newly emerging pressure groups was to ask for a new vocabulary to deal with them on daily basis. My next section will throw some light on this new discourse. Disability discourse and emerging classifications. As stated above, one of the prime questions individuals with different disabilities began to address was the vocabulary used to name them and shame. The word handicapped, for example, literally meant a man with a cap in his hand, clearly indicating his helplessness. The newly emerging groups therefore took upon themselves to fight against the derogatory labelings such as this, which often demeaned their position in the society. By 1980s, this fight grew so louder that became impossible for global actors to remain silent. While adopting a resolution that declared 1981-1990 a decade of disabled, the General Assembly of the United Nations entrusted the World Health Organization with a responsibility to come up with a scientific classification of disability. WHO, after a protracted struggle with its own ideas on human body and well-being, proposed a threefold classification: handicapped, impairment and disabled. As anyone familiar with the debate may agree, WHO's classification reflected two major conceptual models built around the discourse of disability: the medical model and the social model. The medical model treats disability as the sole property of an individual's body. So, it is simply one type of health crisis a person is subjected to, and its treatment depends on its amenability to the markedly available medical procedures. Disability in this model then translates into an impairment with long-term consequences for the individuals suffering from it, and such individuals will have no other option but to accept it and live with it as long as it remains outside the parameters of the modern treatment. The social model of disability considers impairment as an eminent loss of human functioning having its origin in an individual's body but greatly compounded by the social factors in which one is located. One of the major differences between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability, thus, lies in fixing the responsibility and offering plausible solutions to deal with the consequences of disablement. While the medical model deals with it solely as a surgical issue to be corrected, if at all that falls within the realm of possibility. The social model considers the question as a multifaceted event to be handled both within and outside human body. So, in the latter framework, the socio-cultural and economic environment around a person with disability becomes as important as the condition of disability within his or her physical body. Obviously enough, persons with disabilities, their organizations and other civil society groups working for and on behalf of them see merit in the social model as it has a far more comprehensive framework to offer when compared to the medical model. But the national governments and the institutions attached to them find favor with the medical model as it offers tools for precise measurement, which is a prerequisite for administrative decision making and the distribution of welfare benefits. What we have seen so far is a global scenario that largely guided the debate on disability, and this debate certainly had and continues to have very important ramifications for global institutions and national governments in dealing with the questions of disability. This prompts us to look at the scenario back at our home, and the subsequent section is going to do exactly that. Disability law in India. The Indian Parliament enacted the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 in December 2016, bringing curtains down on one of the long awaited policy changes with respect to persons with disabilities in India, who are estimated to account for more than 5% of country's total population. There were other legislative enactments on disability before, some major ones among which include the Mental Health Act 1987, Rehabilitation Council of India Act 1992, Persons with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act 1995, National Trust for the Welfare of Persons with Autism, Cerebral Palsy, Mental Retardation and Multiple Disabilities Act 1999, Mental Health Care Act 2011 as amended in 2017. Of these, it was the Mental Health Act 1987 which defined the word disability for the first time roughly 40 years after independence. What seems to be very little known, however, is that the colonial administration has had two other important legislative enactments dealing with persons with disabilities whose concerns were considered on a quite different footing during those times. While the Indian Lunacy Act of 1912 was intended to lay down rules and procedural code for the treatment of mentally ill, the Workmen's Compensation Act of 1923, which for the first time invoked physical disability rudimentarily as handicap, was brought into effect so as to prescribe appropriate compensation for those who became substantially injured or disabled while being in the employment of major industrial sectors such as railways, mines and plantations. So, the context under which the colonial law made oblique references to the notions of disability had a very different connotation from, say, the issues addressed by the modern disability law in independent India. By all counts, Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995 is considered to be the first ever comprehensive law in independent India, wherein the concept of disability was defined in medical legal terms, subjected to a sevenfold classification and elevated as a subject of welfare policy. This particular legal instrument, brought into effect roughly 5 decades after independence, received high accolades from several quarters as much as it provoked critical thinking on multiple fronts. While those who stood by Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995 seem to have been delighted by the fact that the disabled stakeholders in the country were finally presented with some statutory provisions in matters of health, education and employment, all others, provoked by the limitations of the legislation, pointed their fingers at the sheer welfarism the much awaited law had necessarily promoted. In the meantime, governments both at the center and the state levels showed their usual reluctance in enforcing various provisions of the Act, forcing the judiciary to intervene more frequently than it would have been required otherwise, and to pass binding judgments from time to time. Thanks to the state-sponsored cacophony, the social issues of disability receded to backseat. There had been hardly any meaningful discussion, let alone policy action and social change on issues of accessibility, caregiving, community rehabilitation, legal capacitation, reasonable accommodation, disability mainstreaming, etc. As one looks back now, one is only forced to admit that Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995 continued to exist on the rule book for a little more than 2 decades, only to reconcile with less than half of its actual implementation. Despite the administrative challenges back at home, the Indian government not only went ahead and signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, UNCRPD 2006, but even played a major role in the ratification of the said convention. Once ratified as an internal law, the UNCRPD placed an obligation on all its signatories to bring their domestic laws in line with the protocols of the convention. It was at this backdrop that the central government, after long years of public consultation and intense deliberations, enacted the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. As its title suggests, the new legislation makes a paradigmatic shift from welfarism to rights-based framework, inaugurating a new chapter in disability law in India. In a swift move never seen before, the central government appointed the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 on 19 April 2017 in a short span of 5 months after its enactment and notified its rules within 2 months thereafter on 15 June 2017. Several state governments too quickly followed the suit and began framing rules for the proper implementation of this rights-based legislation. One of the unique features of the new act is its focus not only on public policy but also on private life, thus making inroads into social realm. Protection of rights of women and children with disabilities, adequate provision for caregiving, inclusive education, equal opportunity policy in matters of employment are all now part of the new law, and it would be interesting to see the socio-economic changes the exciting legal framework under reference is likely to bring about. To put the matters in perspective, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016 adopted the same definition of disability as laid down by the UNCRPD. Clause S of Section 2 of the Act states thus: person with disability means a person with long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairment which in interaction with barriers hinders his full and effective participation in society equally with others. The definition offered in the laws is perfectly in consonance with the advocacy of social model of disability. This, however, should not be construed to mean that the perspectives of medical model have been abandoned altogether. A large portion of this legislation dealing with definitions, certification procedures and health related issues is indeed left strictly to the medical understanding of disability. What seems to be remarkable, however, is that the disability law in the country has made an impressive beginning in upholding the principal position of social model of disability. The RPWD Act 2016 identified a plethora of new disability categories that did not find place in PWD Act 1995. The number of disabilities in the new Act has accordingly gone up to 21 from 7 in the old Act. According to Census 2011, persons with disabilities in India constitute roughly 2.1% of the total population. But one major limitation of this number is that the computation was based on just 7 disability categories provided in the old legislation. If the computation were to be modified taking into account all 21 categories as provided in the new legislation, this number is likely to rise to 5 to 6% of the total population, standing tall as one of the major minority groups in our country. It is, therefore, all the more important that there is an ample discussion on issues of disability. As it can be deciphered from the above discussion, disability law in India is becoming increasingly responsive, incorporating both the essence embedded in human rights and the principles inherent in the social model of disability. But this is only a beginning. An impressive beginning at that, and a great deal is yet to be envisaged. As persons with disability are beginning to take equal part in diverse walks of life, our structure should be made sensitive to their special needs, but without overlooking their inherent capabilities and their potential for contribution to building an inclusive society. Thank you.